Hey everybody, so in this video we're going to talk about the section 5.1 from modeling functions and graphs, okay, and it's about inverse functions. So the first thing we're going to do is say, what's the idea of inverse functions? Okay, so the idea of inverse functions is that they're opposites. Okay, they're opposite functions, or sometimes people call them undoing functions. Okay, so the idea is they're the type of opposites where they undo one another. So for example, if you were to add 5, the inverse of that, or the opposite of that, would be to subtract 5. So there are those kinds of functions where you do something and then the other one undoes it. Okay, we could also have something like times 2, and the opposite of that would be divide by 2. Okay, a more recent example we had would be like cube root and then cube. Okay, these are all examples of inverse functions or undoing functions. Okay, so let's give the actual definition of an inverse function. Okay, so here's the strict definition. Okay, so we say that g of x is the inverse of f of x if you plug in a number to f and get an answer, and g does the opposite. It takes the answer and gives you the original number. Okay, so let's think about this in terms of our examples. So this would take a number and add 5, okay? And then you would take that number and subtract 5 and get the original number back. So this does jive with our examples that we had here, okay, where this function is doing one thing and the other function is doing the opposite. Okay, so for example, if we were multiplying by 2, we'd get our answer. Take the answer and divide it by 2, you'd get the original number back. So whatever this function is doing, this one is going to undo that and give you the starting number back. Right? This would cube root and this would cube. Those undo one another and you get the original number back. Okay? So we're going to talk about how to evaluate inverse functions in first a table. Okay. Oops, even before we do that, let's talk about notation. Okay, so the notation for the inverse function looks like this. Okay, you would say f inverse of x. Okay, it is still function notation. This is still the input. Okay, this is the inverse notation. That little -1 is just the inverse notation. It doesn't have anything to do with the number -1. It doesn't have anything to do with exponents or negative exponents. Okay, it is just the inverse notation. Okay. All right, now that we've seen the notation, let's move on to some examples. Okay, so here's our table of values with x and f of x, okay? And then we're going to answer some questions about this, okay? So the first thing we're going to ask is just, okay? All right, now let's talk about how we're going to find the answer to this, okay? So if we think about the definition for inverse, okay, the inverse function is going to take in the answer, right, and give out the original number, okay? So it's taking in y values and giving corresponding x values. So if we look at the table, okay, this is taking in the y value or the output of 2, okay, and it's going to spit out the corresponding input value. So we're looking in the outputs for 2, and then we're going to give the corresponding input of 1. Okay, so our answer would be f inverse of 2 equals 1. Okay, so let's answer one more question about this. Okay, so right now I want you guys to go ahead and look at this table and find f inverse of 1/2. So go ahead, pause the video, and decide what you think your answer is here. Okay, all right. So now that you have your answer, remember that f inverse is taking in output values. So here's my output value of 1/2, and it's going to output the corresponding input value. So I'm taking in the output value 1/2, and I'm giving the corresponding input value -1. So my answer would be formatted like f inverse of 1/2 equals -1. Okay. All right. Now, let's look at another table. Okay, and we're going to answer a couple of questions about this. Okay. Okay, so I want you guys to go ahead and try these on your own, and then in a second we'll go over the answer. Okay, all right, so now that you have your own answer, okay, part A is just the normal stuff that we did at the very beginning where you're evaluating this function. Okay, so the input is 0, and we're giving the corresponding output -2. Okay, here the input is 1, we give the output 2. Okay, this is just a review example so that you guys don't forget that we also know how to evaluate just the function at these values. Okay, now we're going to look at the inverse function. So this is an output value. So here's our output value of 0, and we're going to give the corresponding x value, which is -1. Okay, again, here's our output value of 1, and we're going to give the corresponding input value -2. Okay, last one, we have the output value of -1, and we're going to give, -1 on the output side, and we're going to give the corresponding input value of 2. Okay, so this is how you can evaluate inverse functions from an XY table. Okay, so let's look at some examples of how we can evaluate XY or the inverse function using a graph. Okay, So here's my example. This is my graph of f of x. Okay. And we want to go ahead and answer these questions. So we want these things and these things. So I would encourage you guys to pause the video now and answer part A. We should already know how to do this. Okay. All right, now that you have your own answers, we'll look at these examples. So these are input values, which for the regular function are x values. So we're looking at the x value of -1. Okay, now remember the open dot is not really part of the graph, so we're talking about this point here. And we're going to give the corresponding y value, which is also -1. Okay. This is giving the x value of 3, so we'll go out to 1, 2, 3, and we're going to give the corresponding y value, which looks like 1.5. Okay, remember when you're looking at the values on a graph, you can't be exact. There's no way to tell if this is 1.4 or 1.5, but just give an estimate of that value. Okay, and now we're looking at f of 0, so we're going to the x value 0, which is here, and we'll give the corresponding y value. So 1, 2, 3, maybe 3.7. Okay. All right. So now let's look at the inverse function. So remember the inverse function takes in y values. So we are looking at the y value -2. So we're going to go down to where y is -2. Here's that point on the graph. Okay. And we're going to give the corresponding x value. So this is -1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we'll do the same thing here. Our y value is 0. Okay, so here's where our y value is 0. And we're going to give the corresponding x value, which is 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And we'll do the same thing here. We're going to go to where the y value is 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so that we're talking about this point. And we'll give the corresponding x value, which is 2, right? 1, 2. Okay, so we're doing the same thing that we did with the tables. You're looking for these y values, and you're answering with the corresponding x value. Okay. Let's look at another example of this. Okay. Now that you've seen the first example, go ahead and pause the video. You should be able to answer part A and B based on what we did in the previous example. Okay. All right, now that you have your own answer, remember these for the regular function are intaking x values. So the x value of 0 would be this point, and we're going to give the corresponding y value, which is 1. Okay, now we're looking at an x value of 1, so that's this point here, and we're going to give the corresponding y value, which is like 1.3, right here, between 1 and 2. Now we're looking at the x value of -3, 1, 2, 3, so that's this point here, and that looks like 1/2 as the corresponding y value. Okay. Now for the inverse function, we're intaking y values, so we're looking for the y value 1. Or here's the point with the y value 1, okay, and we're going to give the corresponding x value, which is 0. Now if you look at this and this, these are both referring to the same ordered pair. The ordered pair is 0, 1, okay? These both refer to this same point. These are just two different ways of asking about this point. Okay. Now we're looking for the y value 2, 1, 2. Okay, so that's here, and we'll give its corresponding x value, which is 1, 2, 3. Okay. Then we're looking for the y value 3/4, okay, which is between 0 and 1. So maybe something like right here. Okay, maybe even closer over here. Okay, so this is going to be -1, between -1 and -2. Okay, so this might be like -1.8. Okay, I was pointing to about this point right here, which does look like pretty close to -2. Okay, all right. So that's how you read the inverse values off the graph. You look for the y values that are given, and you give the corresponding x value. Okay. All right. So that's actually all we're going to do in this video. And in the next video, we'll go over graphing the inverse function from the graph of the original function, and also how to find the equation of the inverse function. Okay, I will see you guys soon.